As always, it's good to be here with you all. I used to have a habit that others thought strange. Whenever I got a glass out of the cabinet, I would blow in it. I did it every time, automatically, without thinking. I would often get quizzical looks, and people would ask me about it. It made me self-conscious. I eventually broke the habit, probably when I was in my mid-30s. That's a lot of years of blowing in a drinking glass. So where did that habit come from? Well, I grew up in a 1730s colonial era farmhouse. There was a big plate glass window in the kitchen over the double sink and the counters. And to the right of that, a little cabinet where we kept our drinking glasses. And then right above that, there was another small enclosure with a grate on the front and a exhaust fan inside. My mother would run the exhaust fan whenever the kitchen got smoky. And the fan was old and loud and rattly, and as a child, I was afraid of it. Also, because the house was so old, anytime that it was on, the vibrations would make dust sift down from that upper cabinet, and sometimes little dead bugs into the drinking glasses below. Consequently, anytime you got a drinking glass out of the cabinet, you would blow in it to blow out the dust and debris. So we all come from somewhere, and we carry with us the habits and patterns that were laid down in our childhood. Our parents have a large hand in forming us, and we absorb many lessons from watching what they model. I'm going to share with you today some stories about my mother and the lessons I learned from them. One of the big ones was how to be fully engaged in life. Family legend has it that when she married my father at the age of 29 and after having had a flashy life in New York City working for a magazine, she told him that he should not expect her to just sit at home and cater to him. She had her own interests she wanted to pursue. And she did. She was a stay-at-home mom and never worked out of the house again, but she did tons of volunteer work. She had a passion for historical properties, hence our 1739 farmhouse filled with antiques. She founded a historical society in our town and helped run another one in the county. She researched the historical farms and houses in our area, and when our town celebrated its bicentennial in 1972, several years before the national bicentennial, she spearheaded a number of events, including having a one-room schoolhouse restored and moved to the grounds of the elementary school, and having memorial medallions minted with a picture of a historic mill on the river. She even ran for political office once in our tiny 2-by-2 town. From her, I learned the value of being involved in a community, seeing yourself as part of it, being active in it. And she was adventurous. She loved to camp. She went with me once for a long weekend at a campground in North Georgia with some primitive campsites, an outhouse, and one water tap up the hill near the proprietor's house. Mom would stomp up the hill in her denim skirt to fetch water or bring down another armload of firewood. It ended up raining that weekend. One by one, soggy campers packed up and left until we were the only ones remaining. Fortunately, I have camped a lot in the rain, and I had a system for it. I would string a tarp up over the campsite, tied at the four corners to 4 trees, with the high end over the fire ring so the smoke would rise up and go out, and the low end at the low end of the campsite so the water would drain off and then drain away. Under the tarp would be everything we needed: the tent, a couple of lounge chairs, the picnic table, the fire ring, the wood pile, our food. So we were well positioned when the rain started. For the next 3 days, it continued to pour. We would sit at the table and read, lie by the fire and doze, cook on the camp stove and eat, and hang out and talk. She kept saying, "It's so wet. Don't you girls want to leave?" And we'd say, "Are you still having fun?" And she'd say, "Well, yes." So we stayed. I think she prided herself on being rugged. She went whitewater rafting with us when she was in her 60s and ocean kayaking in her 80s, at which time she was still climbing up on the ladder twice a year to get the leaves out of her gutters. She was interested in astronomy and would frequently drive to the local observatory at night when they were having a program to look at some astronomical phenomenon. She went on annual star parties, weekend retreats where their group would camp or stay in cabins, and she could trudge through the field where they had all set up their telescopes and stargaze all night long. After the space flight disaster, when the shuttle Columbia disintegrated on re-entry, she quickly arranged a trip down to Cape Canaveral to watch the last shuttle launch before NASA's 2-year hiatus in the program, to watch what she called the blast-off. I was privileged to go with her, and it was absolutely breathtaking. But watching her was the best part. She was as excited as a child and gave herself completely over to transcendence and awe. Being engaged in life, embedding yourself in community, being adventurous, finding spiritual connection in the awe and wonder of the universe. These were some big life lessons I absorbed from watching my mother. But there were plenty of day-to-day things I learned from her as well. I remember speaking to my boss one time at my first job out of college, and it came up in our conversation that I would take a shopping cart in from the parking lot every time I headed into the grocery store. He said, "It speaks well of your parents." I was confused at the time, thinking, wait a minute, I'm the one who's doing this courteous thing. But after thinking about it, I realized that I did it because I had watched my mom do it for years. I watched her do other things too. She was a smoker back then, and walking across the parking lot, she would pinch the burning ember out of the end of her cigarette and step on it to put it out, and then put the butt in her pocket to throw away later. From as far back as I can remember, she had bags in the pantry to collect glass and cans for recycling. I don't know where my dad took it. There were no municipal recycling programs back then. I mean, he took it to like a metal smelter or something. And it wasn't something that a lot of people did. But from watching her, I learned to tread lightly upon the earth, to pick up after myself, and to look for little ways to make it easier for the next person who came along. Now, I know we heard earlier about mixed feelings about a parent, a mother, because of some mixed stuff, and so my mother was also a mixed bag. She had this forwardness, this feistiness, this willingness to take things head on. But it was also coupled with a suspicious nature and at times a sense of aggrievement. She had 6.5 acres with a large front yard, including an apple and cherry orchard on one side of a long driveway and what we called the field on the other. The house sat on the banks of Beden's Brook, bigger than a creek, but smaller than a river. The backyard sloped gently down to a wooded area, then dropped off steeply to the wide floodplain. During heavier sustained rains, the brook would overflow its banks and spread out in that low area. I only saw the water overtop the floodplain once. It crept out about 2/3 of the way to the house in 1971 during Hurricane Doria and left water in the basement breastbone deep when the sump pumps couldn't keep up. But for whatever reason, she had long been convinced that the development in the wider area was washing silt into the creek and filling in the floodplain, putting her own house at increased risk. The first time she hired someone to update the property survey must have been in the 1970s after Doria. The man provided the survey with the clear demarcation between the upland where the house was and the lower area that carried the floodwaters, unchanged apparently since the property had changed hands over a decade earlier. My mother was irritated. "That can't be right," she said. She hired another surveyor who found the same thing. This ground and grated on her, and it must have been several years after that she hired yet another surveyor. Same floodplain elevation, same indication of the house being safely out of the danger zone. She called the man an idiot and stashed the survey in a drawer with the other ones. Later, long after I'd moved out of the house and was working in Atlanta as an engineer in a consulting firm, She called me in a panic. She was breathless, distraught, near tears. The property next to her had sold, and a developer was building 4 new houses, 2 of which backed up to her property. They had brought in truckloads of fill dirt and constructed these monstrosities on the hill, not just overlooking her, but, in her view, looming over her menacingly. Now that the grading was complete and the houses were being constructed, she said the runoff from those properties was going to flood onto her yard. "I need an engineer," she wailed. "I need you to come up here right away, tonight. It's an emergency." She was beside herself. I purchased a plane ticket, same-day prices. It was like $1,000. I raced home, packed a weekend bag, and jetted up to give her my professional advice. When I got to her house after dark, we couldn't go out and do anything right then, but at first light, she got me up, and we went out to look at the property line, with her grabbing her hair and saying, "It's awful what they've done. It's criminal. Oh, they've ruined my land." I took a look. It was fine. I pointed out the land surface features and explained how the stormwater would flow. "Look, Mom, see? Here, the water will come down the hill toward you, but there's this ditch thing here. It's called a swale. See? There's a rise in elevation between the swale and your yard. So the water won't come up onto your land. It'll collect in the swale and go downhill into the floodplain. It's no different than when Mrs. May lived here and the water ran off her property down into the brook. The runoff won't come onto your yard." She put her hands on her hips and scowled. "Huh, that's just what the other engineer said." She was lucky I didn't kill her. Still, she persisted in feeling that the development next door was a personal insult and injury. One day, the contractor left a big sheet of plastic out, and during a storm, it blew onto her property. She was furious. She balled it up, caked with mud, and drove up to City Hall, where she marched into the offices and plopped it down on one guy's desk. Mud sprang from it onto his papers. "Mrs. Palmer," he said. She was well known there. "What's this?" She said, "It's trash that blew onto my yard from that development next door." What do you want me to do with it?" "Well," she said, "you are head of sanitation." I imagine we all have stories about our parents where they modeled behavior or thought patterns that we decided not to emulate. It makes me think of that quote by Jennifer Cruz in her book, Faking It. If you can't be a good example, you'll just have to be a horrible warning." I'd say this was my mother's shadow side. She felt everyone was out to get her, that everyone would try to take advantage of her. In retrospect, the sense of aggrievement probably came from years of stewing her brain 24/7 in Fox News, which was always on the television, which she kept on for company. The sense of being cheated, of others getting by with something at her expense, also showed up with some deep-seated prejudices that were likely exacerbated by her steady diet of right-wing propaganda. I remember a time when I was visiting her. I was accompanying her to her doctor. It was about a 40-minute drive, much of it along major roadways that were lined with strip malls. When we turned on the final road toward her doctor, we passed a strip mall that clearly catered to Eastern Indians. There was an Indian restaurant, Indian grocery, Indian clothing store, and henna shop. My mother could hardly contain her irritation. "Where's the strip mall for white people?" she said. Of course, I'm like, every other strip mall we've driven by? She really saw the world as a zero-sum game. If someone got something, it meant that she got less. She had a cleaning lady when I was young who came every other week to dust and vacuum. The woman was African American and lived in inner-city Trenton. Her husband was doing electrical work and got injured when he fell off a ladder, and he got subsidized care through Medicaid. My mother was livid. "No one is paying my medical bills," she complained. "Oh," I told her, "if you want government-funded health care, maybe you should give away all your money and Dad's cushy job and this giant house and go live on poverty wages in Trenton. Bada boom, bada bing. Then someone can pay for your medical care when you fall off your ladder, scratching for income as a handyman." Yeesh. Not only was she quick to take offense, she operated out of a serious double standard. For example, every time there was someone in the news with an Arabic-sounding name or who was Muslim, she would complain about them being terrorists. I pointed out that it was unfair to tar everyone from a single region or a single religion with the actions perpetuated by a few. I reminded her that Timothy McVeigh, who had bombed the federal building in Oklahoma City, was white, but she didn't complain about white people as terrorists. I pointed out that her good friend Nishat was Muslim, but she was a good person, clearly not a terrorist. "That's different," she would say. There's no reasoning with her. I remember a time when I was with her in the car in New York City, driving through some very crowded streets to pick up a family friend. The road was one way. It had 2 lanes of traffic and a line of parked cars on either side. As is apparently the custom in New York, people would often be double parked, sometimes blocking the right lane of travel, sometimes blocking the left. As we crept along with the other traffic, cheek by jowl, as my mother would say, we would periodically come upon a double-parked car blocking our lane. As with each of the cars in front of us, we would need to move over to get past the obstruction. My mother would scowl over her shoulder as she tried to move over, drift over, jerk back, drift over, jerk back. "That bastard," she said, "he won't let me in." Finally, we did manage to move over and get past the blockage, and then return to our own lane. And then sure enough, within a block, somebody would be double parked in the other lane, and all the other cars would be trying to move into our lane to get by. Mom would step on the gas to close the distance between her and the car in front, then step on the brake to avoid hitting them, step on the gas, step on the brake, all the while scowling over her shoulder and saying, "That bastard, he's trying to cut me off." It didn't help when I pointed out that the shoe had just been on the other foot. She couldn't see it. She just couldn't see it. So among the lessons my mother imparted, some were from watching her and deciding not to do that thing. I learned to be mindful of when I was applying a double standard, or when I was making assumptions or acting out of a bias picked up from my own upbringing or from the wider society. I learned to be compassionate toward others, and I try to give others the benefit of the doubt. I try to consider other people's viewpoints and be flexible in my own thinking. So, would my mother be proud of me? I don't know. If there's a heaven, I imagine she's in it. And I'd like to think she would be washed in a transforming love and let go of her petty jealousies and bigotry. Although my brother and I do joke that even in heaven, she would probably need to periodically get a day pass to hell so she could go down and converse with her lawyers to sue her enemies and finally get even with them. There's a meme floating around the internet that says something like, "If you got to live your life over, would you pick your mother to be your mother again?" And yeah, I would. For her own happiness, I wish she had been more open to our common humanity, less paranoid, less angry. But for me, I wouldn't change a thing. All her lessons, both positive and negative, helped make me who I am, and I'm okay with that.